friends eating prawn sandwiches showed a disdain for the glitz and glamour of the theater in which he found himself, but without the very essence he was against he could never have achieved everything he had in the game. The difference between reality and perception is not mine that seems to affect the Irishman, as long as he has been allowed to get on with what he does best. A few years after he had dramatically defied Mick McCarthy by walking out of Ireland's 2002 World Cup training camp on the Pacific island of Saipan, he even watched a comedy musical named I Know that was written about the entire episode as it opened in Dublin's theatres. The show was a firmly tongue-in-cheek retelling of how the Manchester United captain had stuck to his principles when faced with some shoddy preparation from the FAI. Famously, Ireland's officials had failed to ensure training equipment arrived at a location that had no dedicated football pitch, so he offloaded his frustrations in an interview with the Sunday Independent and the Irish Times. Needless to say, the gruff Yorkshireman's accusations of his captain faking injury in the qualifying playoff against Iran, as well as the public admonishment for the newspaper interview in front of the whole squad, did not see Kean retract his stance. Quite the opposite, in fact. You're a liar, you're a fucking banker. I didn't rate you as a player, I don't rate you as a manager, and I don't rate you as a person. You can stick your World Cup up your ass. The only reason I have any dealings with you is that somehow you are the manager of my country. You can stick it up your bollocks. The tirade lasted 10 minutes, with every word driving the wedge between captain and country ever wider as public opinion was fiercely divided between backing the controversial player or condemning him. There was a huge split in the country, said Karl Marr, a long-standing season ticket holder at the Aviva Stadium. I reckon around 70–30% against him. For me, condemnation. The nature of his departure meant a 2-year exile from national team duty as the debate rolled on, but by the spring after his 2004 call under Brian Kerr, a coach Kean respected highly, I know was poking fun at the fallout. Kean later expressed his regret that he hadn't been able to focus on achieving a personal goal of playing at the World Cup. What I should have said to McCarthy was I wasn't playing for him, I was playing for my country, he said. I just felt we needed to change our attitudes a little bit, at least prepare as well as the Germans and the Brazilians. Why not prepare as well as them? People always thought I was looking for perfection, far from it. What I was looking for was progress. Once again, the image of a furious Kean spitting forth aggression fits snugly with the caricatured stereotype that the media have molded over the years, despite missing the cause of the frustration. It is clear that he could have handled the matter more diplomatically, even by his own admission, but the driving force behind his reaction was a scarcely believable amateur attitude towards preparing for the biggest event in a decade, and for most players, in their entire career. Germany's FA even went as far as to build their entire training complex in Brazil in 2014 to ensure their players had precisely what they needed, but here was a nation's squad on a remote island with 2 golf courses, 2 country clubs, but no actual football-specific facilities. Players complained of the horrendous surface which threatened to sprain ankles at every turn, with Lee Carsley and Steve Finnan both suffering injuries from the rock-hard surface. But worst of all, a FIFA liaison officer told Kean even that could have been avoided. We could have watered it if anyone had told us you were coming down. This debacle was not the first time Kean was incensed by poor attitudes and careless planning. Before a Euro '96 qualifier against Austria, manager Jack Charlton, still basking in the glow of a hugely successful World Cup campaign in the United States, took the squad to Harry Ramsden's restaurant to attempt the challenge of eating a foot-long battered haddock with chips and dessert. I was ashamed at the way we went about preparing for games, Kean wrote in his autobiography. Some of the lads reported that their legs went 20 minutes from the end, fought, but they'd passed Harry's challenge. When some observers suggest he could have learned to taper his anger in his role as a very public and influential figure, they ought to remember how he became a powerful man and player in the first place. This was the teenager from Cork who was initially rejected by English clubs, but would not sit down and shrug his shoulders. Giving up was worse than any foul-mouthed ran in his eyes. Only by setting himself standards did he raise himself high enough to become the driving force behind the greatest club side in England or earn the respect of the two most uncompromising managers of all time. Titanic battles between the Irishman and his archenemy Patrick Vieira, and by proxy between Manchester United and Arsenal, characterized the late 1990s. In a face-to-face encounter broadcast by ITV a few years ago, Kean stared deep into the Senegal-born giant's eyes as they reminisced over their era on the pitch. "It was almost my job to keep you down there," Kean said to Vieira. "It was an important role for me that I didn't feel you were going to get the edge on me. I needed to dominate even the players at Man United. I think if I let you beat me in these rivalries in the middle of the park it would have cost me long-term." Their last ever league clash in 2005 epitomized the depths to which the battle was as much a mental struggle as a physical or tactical one. On his way back from the dressing room to collect his forgotten captain's armband, he overheard Vieira threaten Gary Neville with a direct confrontation if he went near Robert Byers, and his switch flipped. "We'll see you out there," he snarled, fingers jabbing in the Frenchman's direction. Psychology has always been central to his style, but whereas others in the game would use modern theories to direct and inspire them, Kean's version was much simpler: never, ever, accept anything other than your best. Although the Glen Haddle Eileen Worry school of faith healing was certainly not his bag, straight talking, logical dialogue was. At Manchester United he would enjoy conversations, not always specifically about football, with sports psychologist Bill Beswick, who he later brought into the set-up at Sunderland when he made his managerial debut in the North-East. Beswick's approach was simple, and it married Kean's outlook on the professional game. What we have to realize about high-level sport is that it's a mental and emotional challenge, the basketball coach turned sports psychologist said during an in-house interview for FC20 a few years ago. A player's behavior on a field is driven by their thinking, their attitude. Words like these were music to Kean's ears. He would approach Beswick for advice about how to manage his own behavior on the pitch, and instead of a highly technical or philosophical response, he would say, "Your first job is to stay on the pitch for 90 minutes." That focus on attitude meant his reaction to a physical encounter early in his career demonstrated his honest approach to self-assessment. While playing for Nottingham Forest, a sloppy back pass from Kean led to a Crystal Palace equaliser in a 1991 FA Cup tie, which infuriated Brian Clough so much he punched a young midfielder in the face. Nearly 2 decades later, Kean reflected on his former manager's attack. "He was dead right, absolutely. It was the best thing he ever did for me. It's good to get angry. It's an emotion and it's part of the game. If people upset you and you don't get angry, I'd say you're in the wrong game." If emotion is part of football, and few could argue with that statement, one would assume that elation and pride would rank pretty highly on Kean's mind when reflecting on his career as a player, given the sheer volume of trophies and adulation he earned. That would be too simplistic a view, though. There were much darker sides to the mental aspect of the game that Kean battled with. "A lot of my preparation would be fear of losing. a fear of letting people down, a fear of letting my neighborhood down, a fear of letting my family down. Fear played a big part of my sporting career. The enjoyment was very, very brief. I'm afraid. Too brief. The attitude towards overcoming negative emotions, as opposed to exulting in the positive ones, was infinitely more central to his way of thinking. However, when he was brought in as assistant to Paul Lambert at Aston Villa, he was told that the squad had a policy of not dwelling on bad results for more than a day. Obviously Villa were used to it, but I wasn't, he was reported as saying. At United we had a culture where, if you were beaten on a Saturday, people talk about bouncing back and moving on quickly, but Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, the lads would be fuming, and I loved that. Many detractors have labeled this level of response as being a sore loser, but the intensity in the pursuit of perfection was undoubtedly what drove Kean and his teammates to be better than their rivals. Was my intensity part of my undoing? Possibly so, there's no doubt about it. But that's part of my DNA, there's no point in saying you should step back from that. Intensity sometimes boiled over into unsavory incidents, as it often does with those who live and play on the edge. When Alf Inchausen stood roaring obscenities at Kean as he lay stricken with a cruciate ligament injury that would keep him out of the game for a year, a challenge was laid down in his mind. Hound felt Kean had been trying to foul him in the tackle and showed no sympathy. This was not something to be passed over. Almost 4 years later in the Manchester Derby, Kean launched his foot at the Norwegian's right knee, sending him flying in the air, as good as ending his opponent's career. Did he regret it? After a long pregnant pause on camera, Kean answered no. He admits that he went out with target aggression on the pitch. I did go out to hurt people because that was my job, but to him, it was all part of a system of measured retribution. The key difference is in the intent. I never went out to injure a player. I had plenty of examples where lads would try and give me stick. My Irish background, the Irish gypsy, stupid talk, in the heat of the moment, an attack on designer. He saw Alan's comments.
I wanna go to hell, cause I'm a piece of shit, it ain't hard to fucking tell. When I die, fuck it, I wanna go to hell, cause I'm a piece of shit, piece of shit, piece of shit. When I die, fuck it, I wanna go to hell, cause I'm a piece of shit, it ain't hard to fucking tell. When I die, fuck it, I wanna go to hell, cause I'm a piece of shit, it ain't hard to fucking tell.
To make a call against them. The subsequent feeling that it had become a Manchester United trait, not that of other top clubs, to pressurize the referees into favoring them with borderline decisions was something that he dismissed. In one of his most iconic matches in the rest of Manchester, he faced what could have been one of the most crushing moments in the player's career, but showed his character and turned it into his most memorable and inspiring moments through sheer brute force of will. The sublime Juventus side of Edgar Davids, Zinedine Zidane and Paulo Montero had raced into a 3-1 aggregate lead in the second leg of the Champions League semi-final when Kean rose to head his side back into contention. 8 minutes later, however, he was booked for a late stretch to tackle Zidane, which would prevent him from playing in the final if his side got there. His subsequent refusal to wallow in the doldrums as he continued with a new vigor to demand the most improbable of comeback victories is lauded today as a seismic act of heroism, but the man himself doesn't see it that way. When presented with a quote from Sir Alex Ferguson on the ITV program in which his manager claimed he was honored to be associated with the player after that performance, the response was typically Kean. He didn't put that in his last book, did he? He joked in his young manner, before narrowing his eyes as he addressed the off-camera interviewer. Stuff like that almost insults me. What am I supposed to do? Give up? Not cover every blade of grass? Not do my best for my teammates? Not do my best for my fellows? To be honest, I actually get offended when people throw quotes like that at me like I'm supposed to be quiet. thus to philosophically crushing his place in the world, but simply to avoid the unnecessary scramble of protection. The property used to belong to Lee Sharp when he was a youngster coming through the systematic crafted around the time he arrived. Sharp was a wildly entertaining winger with audacious ability for the congratulation of the crowd. His stately steps after scoring made thousands of men feel the wind go loose at knees, while his rock star celebrations as he grabbed the quiet line like a microphone on stage was typically flashy. You can bet he never acted a superstar after scoring for any of his clubs, but that isn't to say he was just a senior dressing room general boss. He at the end